By now, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have either heard or seen reports about what President Trump did to the people and the government of Washington, D.C. over the last 2 or 3 days. He basically pushed aside the police department that is responsible to the elected mayor of the city of Washington. That mayor, duly elected in the usual way, was basically told that she is no longer in charge of the public safety, the police function, one of the basic functions all mayors are elected to perform. The government is taking over, just pushing her aside as if the fact of being elected by the people she serves and over whom the police operate didn't matter. The president wanted the power and he took it. All right, let's take a look at this. What was the excuse given by the president? And I say excuse because he doesn't do this normally. Presidents don't do this except in very extreme circumstances. That's why it happens very rarely. So what was Mr. Trump's reason or excuse? His answer, very simple: to combat the awful crime. And he had half a dozen horrible adjectives to attach to the terrible crime. Now, right away, your suspicions should be raised, because when politicians talk about crime, it's usually an excuse that the real reason they're doing something is something a lot of people wouldn't like, but they say it's crime because they hope everybody wants to be down on crime and up on public safety. So let's take a look. There are two sources of statistics for the level of crime in Washington, D.C. The Metropolitan Police Department of that city and the FBI. Both of them, and let me be real clear, both of them agree, both of the sources of statistics, that crime has been going down over the last 18 months, not up. It was at a bad level in 2023, they say. But in 2024, before Mr. Trump became president again, it was really well contained. According to the FBI, crime dropped 9%. According to the police, over 30%. These are very large, very dramatic improvements. Clearly, the people of Washington and their police department and their mayor were doing a pretty good job. Number two, other cities in America have much worse crime statistics than Washington, D.C. If you're going to do this, why Washington? Well, it's a little harder, in the others, because there the mayor is responsible to the governor, and the president might have confronted the opposition of mayor and governor. The way he did when he tried to do the same thing in Los Angeles a few weeks ago. But Washington, D.C. is denied a governor under American law. They don't have senators either. They don't have a congressional representative. And when you think about it, that ought to make the people of Washington, D.C. rather angry. Why? Well, let me give you just two examples. Both the state of Wyoming and the state of Vermont have fewer people, fewer American cities living in them than does Washington, D.C. But both Wyoming and Vermont have 2 senators sitting in the Senate and at least 1 congressional representative. Washington has none of that, even though they have more people. What possible reason is there for this? Well, one of the suggestions made by political scientists looking at this situation is that Washington, D.C. used to have a majority of Black residents and still has a very large African American community. And that probably means that if they got 2 senators and they got a representative like Vermont and Wyoming have, that those would probably be liberal Democrats. And that's why the Congress hasn't allowed them to have the democracy we're so supposed to believe we live in. But I've just begun to look at this. I want to look at it in another way. Did the leaders of Washington, D.C. ask for the government's help? No. Have they made clear their feelings about this? Yes. Unprecedented, the mayor said. Unnecessary, many others said. Why in the world do you not sit down with the mayor of this city, with the police department, with the elected representatives, and talk about a program to develop to deal with the crime problem? That would be the normal, but this isn't about crime. This is about Mr. Trump pandering to his political base. The white president against a community's crime problem, which is presented to most Americans as if it were the community's black crime problem. So you can appeal to white supremacists, can't you? To prejudice against the North, to prejudice of all kinds. What is going on here? Why choose Washington? But now let me take it to another step, because it's a place other commentators will be afraid to go. There is something very like ICE going on here. ICE is a very dramatic idea, a whole new federal police force under the control of the president himself and a couple of people he delegates his powers to. And they are displaying rough tactics, grabbing children, grabbing women, grabbing people who have been working for decades, paying their taxes, performing all the duties of an American citizen. They don't care if you've got a record, no matter what it is, if they've got some papers on you, no matter what they are. That's why they make so many mistakes. That's why they get caught arresting the wrong people, imprisoning the wrong people, deporting the wrong people. It's a scandal. And why do I bring it up? Because it's done for the theater of it all. If you really wanted to stop immigration, or at least slow it down, reduce it, let's suppose that the people of America really want that. Polling recently indicates they don't, but let's assume they do, the way Mr. Trump wants us to believe that he's carrying out his mandate. Well, then let's talk a little bit about it. How much money have the Congress, controlled by President and the Republican Party, which dominates both houses, how much money has been allocated to ICE, to this agency that is basically a police and deportation operation? The answer is, and I looked it up to have it correct for you, $170 billion between now and 2029. That is over the next 4 years, give or take. That's an enormous amount of money. 170 billion. To give you an idea how gross this is, I went and looked up the question, how much foreign aid is given by the United States to all of South America, of Latin America? I picked Latin America because that's where most of the immigrants coming into the United States over the last 10 years, that's where they come from. How much money does the government give to help South America? Well, in the last fiscal year 2024, under Mr. Biden, the total grants of the State Department and USAID came to $2 billion. So let me be clear. What we give to Latin America, which has significantly more people living in it than in the United States, to help them with their problems, economic problems, climate problems, political problems, $2 billion. How much are we spending to catch them, to capture them, to imprison them, to deport them? 170 billion. All right, let me tell you something as a professional economist. If we took half the money we're giving to ICE and made it available to those communities which send the most people to the United States as immigrants, and we know who they are. We know which countries the immigrants come from. We know exactly which countries to go to provide them with the economic supports, the jobs, the opportunities to start businesses, whatever you want, a program to help those people. They don't want to leave their country of origin, leaving behind what few possessions they have, leaving behind the culture they know, the religion they follow, the family they're linked to, the neighborhood. Come on. Nobody wants to do that unless they're under terrible pressure. And when you ask the immigrants, they tell us. They tell us either it's unsafe, there's war, or bandits, or that kind of problem, or it's too poor, it can't sustain people. I can't make a living on my farm, in my job. Well, as I said, half of 170 billion, that's what we're giving the eyes, half of that focused on those areas from which the immigrants mostly come, would give them a chance and a reason to stay there, which they would rather do, because they have the resources, if we help them, to do that. And half of what we're now wasting on ICE, we wouldn't have to waste. It would save the government half of $170 billion. That's a lot. That's a really nice tax cut for Americans, because the government wouldn't need it, because they wouldn't need to spend half of 170 billion on ICE, because the other half had actually solved the immigration problem in a much better, much more humane, as well as cheaper way. Why isn't the president talking to us about that? Why isn't the president trying to get Congress to debate it? They would have a sizable number of people right away would support that. And the majority of Americans would celebrate doing that, as it saves us money, rather than funding ICE, whose reputation gets worse with each passing day. ICE is a theater of Mr. Trump's to look like Mr. Tough Guy. Taking over the police of Washington is a theater of Mr. Trump trying to look like Mr. Tough Guy. Don't be fooled. This is not a solution to any problem, what he does. Real solutions, like the sort I've just sketched out, and I took only 5 minutes to do it, are not what he trades in. He trades in a theater designed to get his base to keep voting with him, in the hopes that what he's talking about is not the screaming BS that it actually is.
The most important economic reality of the last 75 years here in the United States has been the undoing of the reforms carried out by Franklin Roosevelt under the pressure of the socialist, communist, and labor movements of the United States. That's been our number one economic reality. The business community had been horrified by those reforms. Because remember, who paid for Social Security, unemployment compensation, who had to pay the minimum wage that was established, and who had to fund paying all those people getting government jobs? The answer, the business community. The wealthy people of America and the corporations that make them wealthy, you know, the top 10% that own 80% of the shares. They were taxed heavily, and they had to lend money to the government, whatever money they didn't get lost by taxation. So they were doubly angry. All of this effort by the government to help the mass of people at their expense. So they went to work to undo the New Deal. They stopped government hiring of those millions of people, got rid of that. They nibbled away at unemployment compensation. They nibbled away at Social Security. From being a basic way people could live, it's now a support, but only poor people actually live only on Social Security. It's too small, so they've cut back. And forget about the minimum wage. The last time that was raised was in 2009. Even though we've had rising prices every year since, nothing has been raised in the minimum wage. We have behaved as a society savagely towards the poor people who depend on the minimum wage. So we have undone the New Deal of the Great Depression. It turned out that the corporations who had to pay for it and the rich people who had to pay for it got together and went to work to undo the reforms. And they have largely succeeded. That's what the Republican Party's number one priority has always been. Change the tax laws, change the inheritance law, do everything necessary for corporations and the rich to re-establish their absolutely dominant position relative to a mass of people who have economic problems all the time. Yep, we're back to where we were before the Great Depression hit, and all the statistics show it. And there's a lesson for us here. Reformers are the people who want to make a system work better for average people. They do. They're sincere. They mean it. But they don't want to take the step that might guarantee it. Okay, now we come to our situation here and now. The United States succeeded in the aftermath of the Great Depression in ruling out revolution. Revolution was associated with the evil Soviet Empire. The government was very bad. The government was intrusive. The government was dictatorial. All ways to suggest don't go anywhere near where those revolutionaries are. So all that the Republicans and Democrats debate are reforms. Each of them has some reforms they want and some reforms they don't, but the unspoken agreement between them is never to suggest anything that might look, smell, taste, or seem to be revolutionary. The state must be kept out. Some of you have a whole philosophy of that called libertarianism. The state is bad, the state is evil, the state grabs power, the state. Where does that come from? It comes from that split between reform and revolution that came into being around the time of the Great Depression and has been fought ever since, mostly by people who either don't want any change, the so-called conservatives, or many of the reformers who want to keep everything within the realm of reform because they're terribly afraid of the revolution. And we have problems now that are producing the same result. Let's go back to that minimum wage story. It's $7.25, the federal minimum wage. That's outrageous in terms of what it is you can't afford if you work 40 hours a week and get $7.25 paid per hour. It's so gross that reformers in about 30 states have raised the minimum wage in their state, which they can do way above the minimum. Last time I looked, if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of cities and towns and states who have a minimum wage around $15 or more. That's more than double the federal. Reformers were able in those states to get the wages raised. That's like people who didn't like slavery because it didn't feed slaves properly were successful to sometimes get the slaves to be fed better. And you have that here now, too. We don't dare even talk about the reform that they did in the 1930s with the government hiring people who don't get a job in the private sector. That's a way of solving the unemployment problem. We have millions of Americans unemployed right now. The private sector has no work for them. They have no job. Does the government come in and give them a job the way the reformers did in the 1930s? Not at all. Lets them sit out there. Wow. We only discuss reforms, and half of them we don't do. But what would revolution be now? Would it be the government coming in? Well, the answer is no, because what reform and revolution mean, that changes too. Reform, what it means, changes, but so does revolution. One of the things that was learned in the 1930s was precisely that even if you bring the state in, which Roosevelt did as an employer, as a regulator, as a pension provider, as a minimum wage guarantor. Even if you give the state a big role, if that's all you do, then the rich and the powerful remain the employers who gather the profits into their hands. They can, and our history proves that they will, undo the reforms. The lesson of the Great Depression and everything since has been that we shouldn't have gotten caught up in the reform versus revolution, because they shouldn't be seen as either or. They should be seen as reform and revolution. Why? Because the only way to secure reforms is by revolution. It turns out that the way the reformers got slavery to treat the slaves better was by ending slavery. The only way to solve the problems of unemployment and poverty and all the other basic economic issues confronting the United States, which are now building to a crescendo as a desperate government. That's what Mr. Trump's regime represents. A desperate government reaches out and tries unorthodox things, tariffs, firing hundreds of thousands of public employees. These are extreme actions, and they reflect the extremity of the dangers and the crises that have accumulated. They are acts of desperation. However cleverly they are choreographed in front of your evening television news, that's what they are. They are attempts to reform. Mr. Trump's tariffs want to reform the entire global trading system. With Mr. Musk, he wants to reform the entire federal workforce. What it does, how it does it, who does it. These are dramatic reforms. But what you'll never hear from the Republican is one word about changing the capitalist system. And by that I mean, very simply, the arrangement in which in every factory, store, or office, a very small group of people, the board of directors if it's a corporation, the owner, the operator of the business, the partnership if that's what it is, they make all the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And of course, should surprise no one, they take care of themselves first. They're rich, you're not. They're powerful, you're not. They hire and fire, you don't. That's the difference. And the Republicans wouldn't say a word. But because of what happened after the Great Depression, the Democrats won't say a word about that either. During the last presidential election, neither Mr. Trump, nor Mr. Biden, nor Ms. Harris had one word to say about the employer-employee relationship and the imbalance of power and wealth inside every business that shows us. You want there not to be an abuse of the mass of working people, then you're going to have to face it. They're going to have to be in charge. If you don't want masters to abuse slaves, you've got to end slavery. If you don't want employers to abuse employees, you've got to end that relationship. If you look at the distribution of wealth and income in this country, we became much less unequal in the Great Depression of the 1930s. But as soon as that depression was over, by 1945, we resumed the kind of capitalism that creates ever greater inequality until we get to the crazy stage we're in now with the Elon Musk and the Jeffrey Bezos having wealth beyond what ancient pharaohs were able to produce with their slave society. In every society, there is a system of production. Has to be. Human beings cannot live for very long on nuts and berries and running around the woods collecting them. Human societies early on and throughout the millennia have been reliant on producing more and more of what they come to depend on. They produce their own food. They produce their own shelter. They produce their own clothing. and on and on. And Marx's insight is this: in the act of production, inequality is born and maintained and deepened, so that the efforts of good people to go in a direction of equality and fraternity and justice and democracy are frustrated. At best, they achieve them, but they don't last. The way you organize production is the way modern society has frustrated the effort to produce liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. Slogans of the French and American revolutions that produced capitalism in that part of the world. Every society, Marx says, of human beings involves setting some of those people to work, to use their brains and their muscles to transform something they find in nature so that it is better and more useful to human beings. To discover in nature the thing we call a sheep, in order to figure out, which humans did, that you can cut the hair off of a sheep and it is transformable by human labor into wool. And wool can keep us warm at night, wool can clothe our bodies during the day, etc. Learning how to transform lightning into electricity, learning how to transform, fill in the blank. Okay, every society that we know of, human society, carries out the production of more or less of its needs. When the society does it, it, however, also makes a second decision. It decides what portion of the people in the community will be assigned the task of using their brains and muscles to carry out production, and what portion of the community will not have to do that. Now, it starts with communities that want to pass on their community to their children, because you see, children, especially in the early years of their lives, are consumers who literally cannot produce. They're too small, they're too weak, they're too uncoordinated, their brains and muscles, etc. So one of the first things we notice is society saying that the people who produce must always produce more than they themselves consume in order, what? To leave over an extra, a surplus, that can be used, for example, to feed the children. Otherwise, you won't have children becoming adults. They will die. Societies understand that we have to organize who does what, who bakes the bread, who makes the shirts, who cooks the meals, but we also have to do it in such a way that we produce a surplus. That those who work, not everybody, the children, for example, don't, must produce a surplus. They must produce more than they themselves consume in order to sustain others. And now you can see how Marx begins to think. We might also, and that's what slavery begins, have a situation where we say some people, not just children, some adults, are going to be free from using their brains and muscles to produce the food, the clothing, the shelter we all depend on. And who are they in slavery? We know. You know. The masters. They don't have to. They can live in the great house, consume wonderful meals, wear fantastic outfits, and live the life of Riley, because other people are producing so much that we can feed and clothe and shelter them, the slaves, and still have such an enormous surplus that we can take care of the children and also a community of adult masters. And then Marx says, that's how slavery works. The masters, being in charge, keep down what the slaves get to consume. They make the slaves work as hard as possible, produce as much as possible, but take for themselves the minimum. And they'll sustain a group of people who don't do work and give them big sticks and call them the military, whose job it is to beat up on the slaves to make sure they work very hard and keep a minimum of what they produce. Why? Because that brings the biggest surplus for the most magnificent life for the master. And it turns out, Marx says, that getting rid of slavery is possible. We know that there were revolts against slaves wherever they existed, and that they eventually succeeded in overthrowing slavery, whether it was in ancient Rome or the American South in the Civil War or many, many other examples. But what they put in place of the slavery, often feudalism, turns out made people free. No more slaves in feudalism. The serf wasn't the property of the lord. So it changed. But here's what didn't change. You organized production with a small group of people at the top, not masters, because they're gone, but lords, not slaves, because they're gone, serfs. And guess what? The lords used their wealth that they got from taking the surplus produced by serfs to make the serfs work harder and faster, to make them do so at a lower wage or a lower share of the produce. They did a lot similar to what the slave masters did, but a different system, but one that couldn't realize the dream of the slave, which was to be free, the dream of all those who wanted liberty, equality, fraternity, freedom, and democracy. And when feudalism blew up because the serfs wouldn't tolerate it anymore, you had a transition to capitalism. No more slave, no more serf, no more master, no more lord. What you had instead was employee, employer. And guess what? The employees found their wages and their income pressed down, just like the slave and the serf. And the employers accumulated incredible wealth, just like the masters and the lords. Why? Because you had a production system in which some people produced a surplus that they delivered to other people. Therein lies the durability of inequality. Those people who get a disproportionate share use it to keep it. Those denied the fruits of their labor find themselves forever compelled to produce surpluses for the other. The working people today have to go to work to live. At work, they produce a surplus. It shows up as the profits of enterprise. The capitalists get the profits. You probably noticed that. They get the dividends. 4 times a year, an envelope arrives with your dividend. You own shares of this or that capitalist company. You don't do anything there. You don't work there. You just own the share. You're wealthy, and because you're wealthy, you get more wealth. Whereas the worker, because they don't have any of that property, because they're not an employer, are stuck with earning enough to kind of keep themselves alive. Why? Because the employer needs them to be alive and working, otherwise you won't get the surplus that they produce. All human societies are class divided. And by class, he means those who work and produce a surplus versus those who just gather the surplus into their hands. On one side, slaves, serfs, and employees like you and me. And on the other hand, masters, lords, and employers. You know, like Elon Musk. And the gap gets wider. Employers in the United States, according to the U.S. Census, are 3% of our population. The richest 10% of our people own 80% of the shares of stock of American enterprises. Okay, we know what we got. But to change that, to get equality and democracy, we have to change the system of production. No more factory, office, store run by a tiny handful of people who, of course, use their power to get rich, just like they use their wealth to get power. To keep this system going is to frustrate the desire for liberty, equality, and democracy. Or to say the same thing in the words Marx used, the problem is capitalism. The problem is the system that organizes production in this fundamentally wrong-headed way. Wrong because it is the opposite of egalitarian or democratic.